Uh, Good afternoon, NFT Paris. It's great to be here. Hopefully people did not go completely crazy last night. There's plenty more of NFT Paris to go today, and tonight could be a bit of a marathon. But it's great to be here. Thank you very much, NFT Paris, for inviting me. So today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the global regulatory outlook for regulation of NFTs. Some of the previous speakers have alluded to it today and yesterday. By way of my own background, I spent a good part of my career working in regulation of financial services and financial products in the US, and also working with regulators around the world. I'd say that there's a fair number of regulators who have made the jump from traditional regulation into crypto. I'm pretty sure I'm the first to make the further step from digital assets into NFTs. I do expect others will follow because I'm very bullish on the importance of NFTs, both kind of collectible art and gaming and other NFTs that we're seeing, as well as a lot of applications of NFTs for other products, including some of the ideas we've heard about today, whether it's wine or other types of things. So today I'm going to try to give you just kind of a brief overview of what I think are some of the key topics that relate to regulation of NFTs, just looking mainly at Europe, the US, and the UK. Obviously, there's a big world that's interested in these. So currently, I should say also, I work with one of the tremendous pseudonymous thought leaders in the NFT space, known as Punk6529. How many people here have heard of or follow Punk6529? Good. So pretty well known in this group. In any event, within the 6529 group, we have a fund that invests in NFTs. We have a museum of NFTs. We mint NFTs in collaboration with artists. Actually, one of our artists, 6529er, has one of the works that was designed for this event as well. And we also are building a lot of open source tools to solve problems in NFTs, like allow lists. And we recently launched a next-gen contract for generative art NFTs that really lets you interact with composable tools and metadata. I'm not going to go in depth about my background. I currently work with a number of other regulators around the world, mainly in Europe and North America, and previously did a bunch of work in financial regulation, and before that in financial services in New York and London. And before that, went on a game show and won enough money to backpack around the world for a while. So maybe that's how I ended up in NFTs at this point. All right, so on to today's subject. What is really, for people who do worry about it, and maybe if you're not worrying about it yourself, but if you're working on a project or an initiative, there are people around you who are, and that's great, as long as somebody's at least thinking about it. What is the right regulatory model for thinking about NFTs? Is an NFT a digital asset? Pretty obviously and generally in almost all cases. Is it a financial product? It could be. You can very easily design an NFT that has the attributes of a financial product or a financial instrument or security. There's a lot of definitions around the world. But it doesn't mean that they automatically are. The mere fact that something is a digital asset and on a blockchain and is tradable and exchangeable and controllable does not automatically turn it into a financial product, financial instrument, security. And this is, I think, a fundamental thing that really needs to be stated. One size fits all is very much not the right approach. I believe very strongly it's the wrong approach. I think regulators who are used to seeing everything as falling whatever their sphere is may have an instinct to do that. So it's very important to kind of explain things to them that they're not one size fits all, and one size fits all is going to harm the potential for a lot of innovation. So in the US regulatory landscape, I'll start there. I'm American. I spend part of the year in the Northeast and then part of the year in the EU in Cyprus. So I sort of we'll start by talking about the US and then move over to Europe. So in the US, the questions that you need to be thinking about initially, if you do have an NFT project, is the NFT a security? That's really a shorthand way of saying, is the product or initiative or set of activities an offer or sale of securities? Is it a commodity? In the US, we have a very, 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 very broad definition of what a commodity is, and it includes intangible things. And so lots of other intangible things are commodities in the US, including Bitcoin and Ethereum, and then there's some kind of debates about classification of the others. And then, sort of come back to what other questions do we need to ask. So there's been some high attention, high profile enforcement and legal and court activity in the US involving NFTs. Not that much so far relative to some of the other products, but it's happening. So there was a very, very high profile one. Who here has used OpenSea? Yeah, pretty much. Who here has used it in the last 6 months? Okay, smaller percentage. But in any event, OpenSea is really, I think, the first widespread, popular, accessible platform. So a couple of years ago, their head of product, a guy named Nate Chastain, was arrested because he was in charge of, or at least knew what was going to be on kind of the highlight page of OpenSea, and he knew that any NFT that got featured there tended to go up in price because even though it's a decentralized marketplace, there was centralized control of, kind of the home screen. And so, this was actually discovered, not by law enforcement, but actually just by, really the transparency of the space and the fact that everything is on the ledger, and people noticed and then published their research on crypto Twitter. Wait a second, we see this disturbing pattern. Who is this? And eventually they were able to link it back to this senior OpenSea executive, and so he got arrested. The reason I'm mentioning it is because the headlines that you saw were first employee of NFT marketplace charged in first ever digital asset insider trading scheme. So this would imply that that the digital asset was a security, and that this was just like all the other types of stock or M&A takeover insider trading things you might have heard about. Completely not the case. Completely not the case. So in fact, even though he's accused of insider trading and was convicted of insider trading, according to the headlines, in fact, insider trading is a concept that relates to securities law. And in fact, what he was convicted of was wire fraud and money laundering, not insider trading. But in the indictment phase and in the conviction phase, the headlines were all insider trading. The mainstream media regurgitated this as insider trading, but it wasn't from a legal perspective. So you cannot conclude that just because this person, did engage in ethical activity that, was violated laws, but it is not a violation of securities laws. You can't conclude from that NFTs are securities. So those headlines can be very deceiving, and you have to look behind the news. Now, there have been some SEC enforcement actions involving some NFT projects. These started late last year. And if you look at the fact patterns of these really did, at least from my perception, as well as based on the facts that were kind of agreed to and conceded by the defendants, looked like classic variety, people raising money for a project to build a project that looked like an unregistered securities offering. So I think in these two cases, the SEC went after what they perceived to be low-hanging fruit to sort of strengthen their position with regard to these types of issues. So Impact Theory, LLC, they had 3 different categories of these so-called founders' keys. With the founders' keys, there was like gold, platinum, and silver, or maybe gold, platinum, and titanium. The founders, they were building some, internet media activity. They said if you bought these things, then you would get a nice return. They promoted them. They promised returns. That's classic marketing activity. That's part of an offer and sale of securities, an unregistered securities scheme. By the fall of last year, they acknowledged wrongdoing. They had to burn a bunch of the keys that they still had and return a bunch of money. Now, another one, probably a series that more people have heard of, was called Stoner Cats. So the Stoner Cats, they also called it an unregistered securities offering. And I think their analysis was, unlike the allegations of Chastain, that they had this idea that you were going to get a bit, these cats would smoke weed, and then they would become sentient, and then they would do all these things, and these could become sort of fun internet memes. Does seem like an amusing idea to me, but maybe, don't ask a lawyer what they think is funny. Might not be the same as your sense of humor. But in any event, they started to do the work. The idea was you bought the tokens. They were going to produce this animated web series. They started to do some of the work. They did raise a bunch of money. And then the SEC just said, this is a classic unregistered securities offering. It's essentially, it's really like crowdsourcing or crowdfunding. And then there's rules you can do to follow that. And they just didn't do any of these things. So again, they had to pay a penalty. They paid $1 million. They sold all the NFTs in their possessions. So, if you're doing something in the US, think about what is the thing you're doing. It doesn't mean you can't sell NFTs in the US, but it does mean that if you're doing something to really raise money for a business, to make a movie or create a project or make a game or something like that, you could put yourself in a difficult position against the securities laws. Now, there's also been other aspects of the US that look at the legal and regulatory issues. For example, anti-money laundering. The US actually did sanctions on a specific wallet address. They didn't even know who the person was who owned the wallet. They just looked at the wallet activities. And that wallet, kind of when they started doing this, it was people who owned, Bitcoin or Ethereum or Monero or something like that. So they're now, they're going to look at NFTs and wallets that hold NFTs as part of that work. All right, so enough about the US. We're here in lovely Paris, in the heart of Europe. So there's largely good news in Europe with a bit of, let's say, an asterisk around the edges, and I'm a little bit worried about the asterisk. So I was actually in Brussels earlier this week for a discussion on digital asset policy with European Parliament and other regulators on digital assets, then went on to Ghent for further discussions about digital asset policy. Europe has a comprehensive regulation called Markets and Crypto Asset Regulation. It's part of the EU Digital Finance Package. People refer to it for shorthand as MiCA or MiCA. I think Europeans tend to call it MiCA. I call it MiCA like the stone, but I don't know if there's a specification of how you pronounce it, so there may be some flexibility around that. So the Markets and Crypto Asset Regulation, and it expressly excluded NFTs. It also expressly excluded DeFi. There was a panel discussion yesterday with the French digital asset organization, EDAN, where they kind of discussed this regulation as well. So people are putting on it. But on the face of it, this seems great for NFTs. It said, okay, we're aware of NFTs. We'll get to them later. And so we're going to exclude NFTs and DeFi. But it turns out, maybe the coast is not so clear. And so this is something I'm paying a lot of attention to. And anybody, who's Europe-based or Europe-interested and would like to get kind of more involved in this issue, there's a consultation which was put out by this group ESMA, which is kind of like the European SEC. They're actually headquartered in Paris, and the way regulation works in Europe, each country has its own national securities supervisor, and then ESMA is the pan-European group. But then they also have direct responsibility for certain things, and they have responsibility for what's often referred to as supervisory convergence to make sure that the whole EU is doing things the same way, and you don't get regulatory arbitrage between one member state and another, or if one national competent authority is doing things differently from the others. So it clearly says that MiCA does not apply to assets that are unique and not fungible with each other. Sounds great, right? Obviously, NFTs, by definition, are non-fungible and unique. But if they just stop there, it would be fine. First, they go on to say there's no combination of what constitutes a unique and non-fungible crypto asset, and that they're going to look at the substance and the form. Then they really go on to say that you're going to have to prove both uniqueness and non-fungible. So as opposed to saying you're trying to explain an NFT to your friend, you say, well, it's unique and non-fungible. Then they say, well, no, actually you have to prove uniqueness on a scale of 1 to 100 uniqueness or something, and you have to prove non-fungible on a scale of non-fungibility. So how are they going to figure this out? So then they go on to tell us a little bit more about this, and this is the language that I really worry about. And I sort of put some floor penguins here as an example, partly because it's fun to look at the penguins, but also I think it really illustrates the point quite effectively. Any penguin owners in the crowd? All right, great. Well, I don't know if that's one of yours, but anyway. So there's language in the consultation. And so there's a consultation. There's a period to do feedback between now and the end of April, and then there will be a report by the end of the year. So they say NFTs that are part of a series or collection could be considered interchangeable if they share equivalent characteristics, and this can occur where the market views NFTs as having similar value despite unique attributes. So, I think anybody attending NFT Paris would look at these 4 penguins, and they would say, they're extremely different. And yet, if you have something that's, many NFTs are a series of 1,000 or 10,000, sometimes you get something, so you get like, punks and apes that are 10,000. You might get incomplete controls that are 100. A lot of things are 1,000, like the Pebbles drop we just did on the next-gen Art Blocks contract. And so, they have algorithmic uniqueness, but can you really say that there's no relationship of the economic value of one to another? I mean, the market says, hey, you've got a bunch of, I have an OK thing. I don't know what that message is in the middle of the thing. So, all right, can I get back to the penguins? All right, there seems to be a message blocking the penguins, but so maybe the regulators are getting involved even earlier than I thought. So in any event, I think that this creates, some real the potential for regulatory doubt or uncertainty. And so I actually plan to work on a comment letter on this. Very happy in collaborating with other groups or organizations that might care about this topic, because I do think it is potentially consequential, and also to me, it seems like potentially overreach. Like the law says that NFTs are out of scope, and then they say, well, but we have to check out of all the NFTs which ones qualify for the criteria of being out of scope, and then you have to prove uniqueness and non-fungibility, and the fact that the market can, if I wanted to buy one floor penguin or a floor punk and then do another, people probably sort of say, okay, well, the economic value is the same, even though they recognize this as different. So I think there's still some wood to chop in Europe. And I talked about it with the French organization last night, and they seemed less concerned because it's only in the recitals to the statute, not in the actual language. But I think that the regulatory language could become law. Obviously, in the 6529 group, we're very focused on digital freedom, freedom to transact. We work on the meme cards to help illustrate that. I don't know, is this, oh, it's not blocking yours, it's just blocking mine. Okay, yeah, I mean, you can see the meme card in the middle, which represents sort of regulation as a Trojan choice, perhaps, Trojan horse, perhaps, entering the citadel of freedom to transact. One interesting case in the UK and I'll wrap up, and then if we have time for a couple questions. There's some uncertainty in the UK about whether intangible crypto assets can be considered, quote, property, because they have these quite ancient concepts of shows in action, or shows in domain, so different types of things, and can you control it, and do you actually have physical presence of it? But so these cases are starting to come to the courts, and I thought it was interesting that the first one in the UK that involved NFTs involved some boss beauties, and the court, in fact, did allow the plaintiff in the case to obtain a freezing order against these two NFTs. So, I think, this is also an area where I think for the most part having greater legal and regulatory certainty, as well as technological connection between, kind of what's happening in the digital sphere and what's happening in the physical sphere, and the ability to enforce these things with courts is going to be very important. I think that will actually empower, a lot of, commerce and broader adoption of NFTs beyond kind of the initial utilization of digital only to things that have more bridges between the digital and physical world. So in any event, if we have time, I'm happy to take one or two questions if people haven't heard enough about regulation and the regulatory landscape for, for a weekend. And thank you very much for having me. Yeah. Oh yeah, sure. This is a very important question. And yeah, I'd like everybody to hear it. Can you pass him a?
And just generally wondering when is.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this year we noticed a lot of M&As from subducks to lions, and recently moonbirds, and there is always like a floor sweep coming from anonymized wallets who probably have a little bit of news or just speculatively buying up these assets and someone benefiting out of it, right? Like, so when will these be getting looked into? Who's going to be at the centerpiece of these investigations, or would there be any as well?
Yeah, that's a great question, and the first example you gave, I don't know if I saw as closely, but yeah, just recently in the last couple of weeks, there was the announcement that Yuga was acquiring Proof, and of course Yuga is the owner of Bored Apes and Otherside and Larva Labs and MeBits and a whole bunch of things, and then Proof, among other things, has this collection called Moonbirds. I think a lot of Moonbird owners had been, it's one of those collections that opened with a lot of promise and a lot of hype, including from the kind of some of the people behind it, and then I think seemed to really kind of diminish, and people were sort of saying they didn't deliver anything, or have they delivered anything? And as you say, 3 or 4 days before the acquisition was announced publicly of Proof by Yuga, a lot of Moonbirds got bought. They went up in price. A lot of that was anonymized. So I think, it's interesting. In order for who's looking at it and who has jurisdiction. Like first of all, I do think, if these are, it clearly looks like what we would colloquially call insider trading, right? Somebody knew something was coming. It seems extremely reasonable to infer that. So that kind of goes back to the example of the Chastain, the Chastain case, where he had. Sorry, go back to this. So he sort of knew that there was going to be an event that would drive up the value of these NFTs. In fact, it wasn't like the Department of Justice or prosecutors somewhere, if we were looking for this, people on the internet noticed it and started talking about it on crypto Twitter, and eventually that reached the attention of authorities. And then there's actually often specific whistleblower authority to be able to do that as well. So, it would seem that the same thing, the kind of the misappropriation, let's say it was an insider at Yuga or at Proof, who knew about this under kind of misappropriation and wire fraud, it sounds like there could easily be a cause of action. You'd have to kind of associate those wallets with a person, and maybe the person who did it, if somebody really looks into it, there will be, it may have been a little sloppy, they might have missed something, they might be able to catch them, especially because, if the government gets involved, they have subpoena power, so they can ask, if there was, a bridge where the funds went to or from, a centralized exchange to these wallets. So there may be ways to do it. Will the SEC get involved? They would need to have a legal theory that, because it was a corporate activity involving, one company acquiring another company, then maybe there is some kind of securities law theory. It sounds to me more likely that it's closer to the fact pattern of Chastain and OpenSea, in which case it might be more of a misappropriation, wire fraud, and maybe money laundering. At this point, the Justice Department, the SEC, the CFTC, a lot of these places do have cyber units that are looking at these. But it may be, somebody needs to solve it for them and hand it to them gift wrapped, which is really what happened to by the time it went to the prosecutors, it was completely gift wrapped for them, from everything I can tell. All right, yes?
You gave some example on the US regulation landscape or also the EU landscape. What do you think about the future of international regulation? Do you think we have a possible international standard on it? Also taking into account of the East Asia situation, because there is also very dynamic market. So, okay, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. And I spend a lot of time personally talking to regulators about policy. Partly, just sort of develop relationships with them around the world from kind of my earlier work in government, setting up kind of blockchain regulation or doing some trainings in that area. And also because I just think it's interesting. And with NFTs, I personally have a view that NFTs are very, very important, even beyond, the early use cases like art, collectibles, gaming, and many other, much broader use case around individual sovereignty and digital freedom, and essentially what Bitcoin is for money, NFTs are for any type of property, moved around on the internet with self-sovereignty. So it's an incredible, important thing. But sometimes when I talk to regulators who are busy with other things, I think it's maybe more helpful for us if they think it's just a bunch of nerds trading cartoon monkeys, and they don't think it's that. So I will say I haven't really done a lot to advocate, or if people don't think it's that important. So I would say internationally. So here's a direct answer to your question. Internationally, other than with respect to kind of tax and money laundering, I don't think there's really that much focus on NFTs. So I don't think, there's a lot of things the regulators are worried about. They're worried about the centralized exchanges. They're trying to wrap their hands around DeFi. They're trying to wrap their hands around, implementing a lot of the new anti-money laundering requirements. So, I don't think, and I'm not seeing, really any country that's saying, okay, we now need an NFT regime. What I have heard is that they've said things like, well, if we have somebody who's providing custody that we regulate because they're, a Bitcoin and Ethereum custodian, and they're now starting to custody NFTs, because we regulate them, we need to look at their practices and risks of loss in that areas. So, I do think that in East Asia, there's some of the most forward-looking and advanced crypto regulatory frameworks and and commitment and personnel for supervision. But I haven't seen anything concrete that's, problematic, like, for example, the proposals in the potential wording in this ESMA consultation. Right. Okay, yeah, one more. Can we get him the mic?
Well, thanks for the presentation. And I have a question about, the anti-money laundering, regulation.
Sure.
And I know, allegedly North Korea is involved in, anti-money laundering using, cryptocurrency. And I wonder if, only if it is found that this regime is involved in, using an NFT as a tool to fund themselves. Do you think this would be a game changer for them, for the entire market, to be regulated by these three big players, or internationally, the sanction, for example, like OFAC?
Yeah. So OFAC, so the technology already exists to do, sanction screening for wallets, and and I think there's an expectation that for example, the infrastructures in the space are doing screening for wallets. Sometimes maybe it's over a de minimis level. So if it's a 25-cent NFT, you wouldn't. But if it's above some of the thresholds for transaction monitoring, you could do that. So so I think in time as these get phased in, I think the ability to look at what the wallet is and whether it's been placed on an OFAC sanction list. And so that's why I did give the example that there in fact has been a sanction list. So there have been the first couple of sanctions lists that mentioned wallets said they believed they belonged to Hamas or Hezbollah or like Islamic Jihad or some group like that. But the group the one I highlighted on the slide was the first time I had seen like a sanctioned wallet where the wallet actually held a couple of NFTs as well. So I think there is that risk. It's just like another mechanism that could be used. I think for them to make a ton of money with it, they would really need to figure out how to scale it. I don't think there'd be enough tiny transactions, although layering or structuring is another thing that gets looked at. Yeah, thanks for the questions. So I think I'm out of time or a little bit over time, but again, thanks so much for having me and for all the great questions. Yeah.